There's a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It's the loneliness of standing in a room full of people who don't know who you are, or standing outside one. Eleanor Hayes was 81 years old. She had spent 53 years as the wife of a soldier. She knew how to wait. She knew how to hold herself together when things fell apart around her. She knew how to stand still and not show what the standing was costing her. She was doing all three on the steps of a funeral home on a Tuesday morning in October, when the director told her she wasn't on the list and couldn't come in. Her husband's funeral was starting without her. She didn't argue. She just stood. Inside, 6 Marines stood at attention over the casket of Sergeant Major James Hayes. One of them saw her through the glass. He saw a woman standing the way only one kind of person stood at a soldier's funeral. He turned. 5 turned with him. Subscribe if you're new. Stay with me. Share this tonight. Because what those 6 men do in the next 60 seconds is what humanity looks like when it's working. Eleanor Hayes had married James on a Saturday in June 1971. Not a big wedding. 30 people. A church on the east side of Atlanta that still smelled like wood polish and old hymnals. A reception in the church hall with food that 3 aunts had spent 2 days making. James had worn his dress uniform, not to impress, because it was the only good thing he owned. She'd thought he was the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. She still thought that. He'd been deployed 4 months after the wedding. She'd known it was coming. You didn't marry a soldier in 1971 without knowing what was coming. She'd stood at the airport and watched him go and made herself a promise she'd kept for 53 years. No falling apart in public. Fall apart at home. In private. In the specific, necessary privacy of someone who understood that other people's worry didn't help anyone, and that strength, real strength, not performed strength, was what the situation required. She'd cried in the car on the way home from the airport. She'd made dinner when she got back. She'd kept going. He'd come home, then gone again, then come home. That was the shape of it. 34 years of the shape of it. Each departure, she learned something new about herself. Each return, she learned something new about him. What war did to a person wasn't always visible. Sometimes it lived in the way he held his coffee cup in the morning, the way he sat with his back to the wall in restaurants, the way he woke up at sounds she didn't hear. She'd learned his language. Not the language he spoke, the language underneath, the one that didn't have words. She became fluent in it over years, the way you became fluent in anything, by paying attention without demanding explanation. He'd retired in 2005, Sergeant Major, the highest enlisted rank. She'd gone to the ceremony, sat in the front row, watched 30 years of colleagues shake his hand, watched her husband, who had never once told her he was proud of what he'd done, stand a little straighter than usual. She'd known then. He was proud. He just didn't know how to say it to her. She didn't need him to say it. She'd seen it. The Tuesday morning was ordinary. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Ordinary. She'd been in the garden, pulling weeds from around the rose bushes James had planted the spring before. She'd heard nothing unusual. That was how it happened. Not with drama, not with warning, just. She went inside and he was in the kitchen and she knew. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been. She'd made the calls, arranged the service, written the obituary herself, because nobody else knew what to say about James the way she knew. Sergeant Major James Arthur Hayes, 34 years of service, husband, father, grandfather, a man who came home from everything and chose, in the long peace afterward, to plant roses. She'd written that last line 4 times before she kept it. It was the truest thing she knew how to say about him. Patricia's flight had been delayed. She'd told her daughter to board the plane. She'd called a cab. The cab had dropped her at the wrong entrance. By the time she walked around to the front, the service had begun, and a young man with a clipboard stood at the door. Name? Eleanor Hayes. I'm sorry, I don't have that name. She looked at him. She'd spent 53 years being the wife of a man the Army knew by rank and number. She'd spent 53 years being Eleanor Hayes. She was still Eleanor Hayes. She was still his wife. The list didn't know that. The list was wrong. She stepped back from the door. She stood on the steps, in the black dress, in the October cold. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying. She just stood the way she'd always stood, when things required standing. Still, straight, present, not asking for anything, not expecting anything. Just there, because James was inside and she was going to be as close to him as she could be, even if close meant the steps. Even if close meant standing outside a door that should have been open. She'd waited before. She knew how. Richard Hollis had been a funeral director for 19 years. He was good at his job. Not good in the way that people said you were good at things to be polite. Good in the specific, earned way of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades in rooms where people were at their most broken and had learned how to hold space for that without breaking himself. He knew grief. He'd seen every shape of it. He'd held the hands of parents who'd lost children. He'd guided families through the specific administrative nightmare of sudden death. He'd sat across from widows and widowers and siblings and children and helped them navigate paperwork when paperwork was the last thing any of them wanted to think about. He was not a cruel man. He was a procedural one. That morning, he had 214 guests to manage. A service beginning in 4 minutes, a security protocol that the family had specifically requested. James Hayes had been a high-ranking military official, and there were people attending who required verified access, and a list that did not include Eleanor Hayes. He had a job to do. He was doing it. He'd seen her coming from 30 feet away. Small woman, elderly, black dress, moving slowly but not uncertainly, the specific, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going and was taking the time the distance required. He'd felt the thing he always felt when he saw someone approach alone. Not suspicion. Preparedness. Someone coming alone to a funeral was someone who needed to be handled carefully. He'd positioned himself at the door. He'd waited. He'd asked for her name. He'd looked at the list. He'd looked again. He'd felt the specific, sinking recognition of a problem he hadn't anticipated and didn't have time for. "I'm the wife," she said. He looked at her. He believed her. That was the thing nobody would understand later when he tried to explain it. He believed her completely, and he still couldn't let her in. Because the protocol existed for a reason. Because 214 guests had been verified and cleared. Because the family had specifically requested security measures. And he was one person at one door. And he had no way to verify what she was telling him against the list in his hands. He'd been lied to before, not often, but enough to know that feelings weren't procedure. "If you can reach a family member who can verify." "My daughter is on a plane," she said. He heard it, the flatness in her voice, not anger, not desperation. Something more devastating than either. The voice of someone who had already accepted that the world was going to make this harder than it should be, and had made their peace with it. "I'm so sorry," he said. "If you'd like to wait outside." She stepped back. She turned. She stood on the steps. He watched her for a moment. He turned back to his door. He had a service to manage. Inside the funeral home, 214 people sat in rows facing a casket draped in an American flag. At the front of the room, 6 Marines stood at attention, dress blues, white gloves. The specific practiced stillness of men trained to hold position regardless of what their body wanted to do. They'd been standing for 11 minutes. They would stand for however long was required. That was what they did. Sergeant Marcus Webb was the third from the left, 34 years old. He'd served 8 years before transitioning out. He'd been part of honor guard details before. Enough to know the weight of what they were doing. Enough to understand that standing at attention over a casket wasn't ceremony. It was debt. Every soldier who had served was owed this. The stillness. The precision. The acknowledgement that what they'd given mattered enough to be marked properly. He took it seriously. He took everything about it seriously. He saw her through the glass panel beside the entrance door. Not because he was looking, because she was there, and something in the way she was standing made his eyes find her before his brain had finished deciding to look. He didn't know her. He'd never seen her face, but he knew that stance. He'd grown up around that stance. His grandmother had stood like that outside the hospital when they'd told her visiting hours were over, and his grandfather was still inside, and she hadn't left. Just stood, still, straight, present. The specific posture of a woman who had spent decades holding things together by refusing to collapse. He'd seen it in his mother, too. Standing outside his school the day they'd told her, there was a problem with his enrollment paperwork, and she couldn't come in until it was resolved. She hadn't left. She'd stood. The way Eleanor Hayes was standing now, the way women who had spent lifetimes waiting for systems to see them, stood when systems refused to see them again. He knew that stance. It lived in his chest before it registered in his mind. He didn't decide to turn. That was what he'd say later when people asked. I didn't decide, I just turned. Like the body knew before the brain caught up. Like 34 years of watching the women in his life stand outside doors they should have been inside, had built something in him that responded before he had the chance to talk himself out of it. He turned. The Marine to his left saw him turn. She turned. The Marine to his right turned. Then the fourth. Then the fifth. Then the sixth. 6 Marines turning away from a casket inside a funeral home toward an old woman standing alone on the steps outside. No signal, no order, no one said a word. They just turned. Because some things you didn't need words for. Some things you felt in your body before they reached your brain. Some things, an old woman in a black dress standing outside her husband's funeral, required no explanation and no deliberation. They just required turning. Richard Hollis saw them turn. He was at his post by the door. He watched 6 Marines in dress blues pivot in unison toward the glass panel. He followed their line of sight. He looked at Eleanor Hayes, standing on the steps. He looked back at the Marines. He looked back at Eleanor. He'd been a funeral director for 19 years. He'd never seen an honor guard turn during a service. He'd never seen anything that made 214 people go quiet before a single word had been spoken. He looked at the woman on the steps, in the black dress, in the October cold, not crying, not demanding, just standing. And he understood, in the specific stomach-dropping way, you understood things you should have understood sooner, exactly who she was. Not because of the list, not because of paperwork. Because of the way 6 Marines were looking at her through a glass panel with the specific recognizing attention of people who knew exactly what they were looking at. He opened the door. Marcus Webb stepped forward first. Not dramatically. One step, the specific, measured step of someone who had made a decision and was implementing it without announcement. The other 5 followed. Still no words. Still no signal. Just 6 men in dress blues walking toward a glass panel and the woman standing on the other side of it. Richard opened the door before they reached it. He'd seen enough. He stepped aside. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it smaller than it was. Eleanor looked at the open door. She looked at the 6 Marines standing in the entrance. She didn't move immediately. Not because she was surprised. Because she was 81 years old and she'd learned that moments that mattered deserved a second before you walked into them. She took the second. Then she walked forward. Marcus stepped to her left. The Marine beside him stepped to her right. The other 4 fell into position behind them. An escort, not ordered, not rehearsed. The specific instinctive formation of people who understood ceremony and understood what this moment required and gave it without being asked. Eleanor walked between them. Small woman, black dress, surrounded by 6 men in dress blues, moving in step with her pace. Not her adjusting to them adjusting to her. That was the part. 6 trained Marines slowing to the pace of an 81-year-old woman who had been standing outside in the October cold and was now walking into the room where her husband was. 214 people watched them come in. The room had been quiet before. It went quieter. The specific different quality of a room that was already silent becoming something more than silent. Something that didn't have a name. The closest word was witness. 214 people becoming witnesses to something they hadn't expected to see and couldn't look away from. Nobody had told them anything. They didn't know why 6 Marines had turned. They didn't know who the small woman in the black dress was. They didn't need to. Some things communicated themselves without explanation. A woman being walked to her seat at her husband's funeral by 6 men in dress blues moved through the room the way true things moved, without effort, without argument, landing in the chest before the brain had finished processing it. People were crying before she reached her seat, not because they knew her, because they knew the shape of what they were watching. The seat was in the front row, center, where she should have been from the beginning. Marcus held it for her. She sat. She looked at the casket, at the flag draped over it, at the specific, careful folds of it. 53 years of knowing what that flag meant and what it cost, and who paid the price the country didn't always want to talk about. She put her hand in her lap. She looked at James, at the casket that held him. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying. She just looked. The way you looked at someone after 53 years. Not with grief exactly. With the specific, full attention of someone who understood that looking was all they had left, and they were going to use every second of it. Marcus returned to his position. He didn't look at the room. He didn't look at Richard Hollis. He looked at the middle distance the way he'd been trained to look, but he felt the room. He felt the 214 people who had gone quiet. He felt the weight of what had just happened settle over the service like something necessary, like something that had been missing and was now found. He thought about his grandmother, standing outside the hospital, not leaving. He thought about his mother, standing outside his school, not leaving. He thought about every woman he'd ever known who had stood outside a door that should have been open and had not been, and had stood there anyway. Still, straight, present. He thought about what it cost. All that standing, all that dignity maintained in the face of systems that required you to prove you belonged somewhere you'd been the entire time. He thought about the fact that he'd turned, and that 5 men had turned with him, and that Richard had opened the door, and that Eleanor Hayes was sitting in the front row where she should have been from the beginning. He thought about how close it had been. He almost hadn't turned, not because he didn't know what he was seeing, because he was in the middle of a service and turning wasn't protocol and there were rules about what you did during a formal ceremony, and his body had turned before his brain could list all the reasons not to. He was grateful for that. For the body knowing before the brain argued. The officiant spoke. He talked about James Hayes, about the service, about the man. Eleanor listened. She knew all of it. She knew more than all of it. She knew the version of James Hayes that 34 years of service didn't capture. The version that made eggs on Tuesday mornings. The version that planted roses in the spring. The version that held her hand at his mother's funeral in 1983, because that was what James did. He showed up and he held on. She listened to the officiant describe her husband and thought about all the things the words left out, all the things only she knew, all the things that lived between two people over 53 years that couldn't be put in an obituary or said at a service or captured in the specific, formal language of death. Those things were hers. They would always be hers. Nobody could put them on a list and lose them. She looked at the flag on the casket. She thought about the day she'd made herself a promise at the airport in 1971. No falling apart in public. She'd kept it for 53 years. She was keeping it now. Not because she wasn't devastated. Because James would have known the difference between strength and performance, and he'd always loved her for the real version. She was going to give him the real version. Right to the end. The officiant's name was Reverend Thomas Cole, 63 years old. He'd presided over more funerals than he could count. Military funerals specifically had their own weight. The flag, the precision, the specific gravity of a room full of people who understood sacrifice in ways most rooms didn't. He'd been speaking for 4 minutes when Eleanor walked in. He'd stopped, not because protocol required it, because some things required stopping. He'd watched 6 Marines escort a small woman in a black dress to the front row. He'd watched 214 people go quiet in a way that was different from the quiet they'd already been. He'd waited until she was seated. Then he'd continued. But he'd changed what he was going to say. Not planned. The moment required something different than what he'd prepared, and he'd learned a long time ago to trust that. He'd known James Hayes not well. They'd met 3 times. Twice at church events, once at a community function where James had sat quietly in the back row and said almost nothing, and Reverend Cole had thought, this is a man who has learned that listening is worth more than talking. He'd been right. James was that kind of man, the kind who showed up and paid attention and let his presence do the work that other people used words for. Eleanor was that kind of woman. He saw it now, sitting in the front row, back straight, hands folded, looking at the casket with the full, undivided attention of someone who understood that this was the last time and was not going to waste a second of it. He thought about what James had told him once. One of the 3 times they'd met. The bravest thing I ever did wasn't in uniform, James had said. It was coming home and figuring out how to be a husband to a woman who'd held everything together while I was gone. That's harder than anything the Army asked of me. Reverend Cole had written it down. He used it now. Sergeant Major James Hayes served this country for 34 years, he said. He came home from things most of us will never understand. And he told me once that coming home was the hardest thing he ever did. Not because of what he'd seen, because of what he owed. He paused. He owed it to the woman who had held everything together while he was gone, who had raised their children and managed their home and carried the weight of a life that was meant for 2 people, and sometimes had to be carried by one, who had stood in airports and said goodbye and driven home alone and made dinner and kept going. He looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Hayes, your husband knew what you gave. He knew what it cost. And he spent 34 years trying to be worthy of it. Eleanor did not cry. She looked at Reverend Cole. She nodded. Once. The specific nod of someone receiving something true. Not agreeing. Receiving. In the 4th row, a woman named Diane pressed her hand to her mouth. She didn't know Eleanor Hayes. She'd come because her father had served with James, 2 years in Germany, 1978 to 1980. She'd come to honor a man she'd met 3 times as a child. She hadn't expected to sit in a room and see her own mother. Not literally, but the shape of her. The woman who had held everything together while her father was gone, who had made dinner and kept going, and never once showed her children how much the keeping going cost, who had stood in an airport in 1978 and watched her husband board a plane and driven home and made dinner. Diane had been 6 years old in 1978. She hadn't understood. She understood now. She was crying for Eleanor Hayes. She was crying for her mother. She was crying for every woman who had ever stood in an airport or on a front step or outside a door and held themselves together because the situation required it. The room was full of people crying for someone they'd never met. Because Eleanor Hayes wasn't a stranger. She was everyone's mother, everyone's grandmother, everyone's wife, who had given more than they'd been given credit for and had stood straight and present even when the giving had cost everything. Marcus stood at attention. He felt the room shift, not physically, emotionally, the specific collective shift of 214 people moving from attending a funeral to understanding one. There was a difference. Attending was showing up. Understanding was being changed by what you saw. The room was being changed. He could feel it. He thought about something his grandmother had said to him once. He'd been 17. He'd come home from school angry about something. He couldn't remember what now, the specific, consuming anger of a teenager for whom everything felt like injustice. She'd listened to him talk for 10 minutes. Then she'd said, "Baby, you want to know what strength looks like? It's not the person who makes the most noise. It's the person who keeps moving when they have every reason to stop." He'd been 17. He hadn't fully understood it. He was 34. He understood it completely. He was looking at it. Eleanor Hayes keeping moving, even when the door was closed, even when the list didn't have her name, even when the October cold was working against the black dress that hadn't been worn since 1983. She'd kept moving, not because she was unaffected, because she'd decided a long time ago that affecting her was not the same as stopping her. That was the strength his grandmother had been talking about. He'd been looking for an example of it his whole life. He'd found it on the steps of a funeral home on a Tuesday morning. Richard Hollis stood at the back of the room. He'd taken a position near the rear wall after opening the door. Away from the entrance, away from the clipboard, away from the list. He was watching Eleanor Hayes sit in the front row. He was watching Reverend Cole speak. He was watching 214 people cry for a woman most of them had never met. He was thinking about the 30 seconds before he'd opened the door, about watching 6 Marines turn, about following their line of sight to an old woman on the steps, about the stomach-dropping moment of understanding. He'd opened the door. He'd done the right thing. 19 years. He'd never gotten something this wrong before. Not this wrong. Not in a way that had required 6 Marines to correct him. He stood at the back of the room and held that, not defensively, not making excuses to himself about protocol and lists and security measures, just holding it. The way you held things that needed to be held without being explained away. He'd been procedural when the moment required him to be human. That was the gap. He'd spent 19 years learning to hold space for grief. He hadn't recognized it when it was standing on his front steps. He recognized it now. He was going to think about that for a long time. The service continued. A choir sang, "Precious Lord, take my hand," the specific hymn of funerals that had been sung at more goodbyes than anyone could count. The song that existed because some feelings were too large for speaking and needed music to carry them. Eleanor closed her eyes. She knew every word. She'd sung it herself at James's mother's funeral. In 1983, in this dress, she sang it now, quietly, to herself, or to James. There wasn't much difference anymore. The choir finished. The room settled back into its specific weighted quiet. Reverend Cole returned to the podium. He had 3 more things to say. He'd prepared 6. He'd decided 3 were enough. The room had already said the rest. Eleanor sat in the front row and breathed. That was what she was doing. Not performing composure, not holding herself together, breathing. The specific, conscious act of someone who had learned that when everything else was taken away, breath was still yours. Nobody could put breath on a list. Nobody could tell breath it wasn't verified. She breathed. She looked at the flag on James's casket. She thought about the first time she'd seen that flag. Not draped over a casket, folded, in James's hands. He'd brought it home from his first deployment, a small folded flag he'd been given at a ceremony she hadn't attended because she hadn't known it was happening. He'd put it on the kitchen table. He hadn't said anything about it. She'd looked at it. She'd looked at him. "What's this for?" she'd asked. "Just in case," he'd said. She'd understood. She hadn't asked again. She'd put it in a box in the closet. She'd looked at it every few years. Just in case had lasted 53 years. Now just in case was draped over the casket of the man who had brought it home, and she was sitting in the front row, breathing and looking at it, and thinking about how young he'd been when he said those words. How young they'd both been. How much they hadn't known yet. How much they'd learned. 3 rows back, a man named Gerald Washington was not crying. He was doing what men of his generation had been taught to do in rooms like this. Holding it. Holding it the way his father had held it, and his grandfather before that. The specific generational discipline of men who had learned that emotion in public was a luxury they hadn't been given permission for. He was holding it. But his hands were different. They were pressed flat on his thighs with the specific white-knuckled pressure of someone containing something large in a small space. He'd served with James, not in combat, stateside, 1989 to 1991, 2 years, long enough to know a man, long enough to know what kind of man James Hayes was. The kind who noticed things. The kind who, when Gerald had gotten news from home, bad news, the specific bad news of a marriage falling apart while you were stationed 2,000 miles away, had sat with him, not talked. Sat. For 3 hours in a rec room in a base in Georgia, just sat. Because James Hayes understood that sometimes what a man needed wasn't advice, wasn't solutions, wasn't words, just someone willing to stay. Gerald had never forgotten that. You didn't forget the people who stayed. He pressed his hands harder against his thighs. He held it. He thought about staying. He thought about all the forms staying took. Eleanor on the steps. Not leaving. 6 Marines turning, not looking away. He thought about his own life, the times he'd stayed, the times he hadn't, the specific, irreversible weight of the times he hadn't. In the seventh row, a teenage girl named Amara was sitting next to her grandmother. She was 15. She had not wanted to come. She hadn't known James Hayes. She hadn't known why her grandmother, who had known Eleanor for 40 years, needed her specifically to be there. Because you need to see this, her grandmother had said. See what? Amara had said. You'll know when you see it, her grandmother had said. Amara had rolled her eyes. She was 15. Rolling her eyes was still available to her. She'd come. She'd sat. She'd watched Eleanor Hayes walk in, escorted by 6 Marines. She'd watched the room go quiet. She'd watched Eleanor sit in the front row and look at the casket with the full undivided attention of someone who understood that this was the last time. She hadn't rolled her eyes since. She was watching Eleanor breathe. She was thinking about something she'd never thought about before. What it looked like to love someone for 53 years. Not the feeling, the shape of it. The specific daily shape of a love that had survived deployments and airports and Tuesday mornings and lists that didn't have your name on them. The shape of a love that brought you to a funeral home in a black dress you hadn't worn since 1983 and stood you on the steps in the October cold and still didn't break you. She was 15. She didn't have a word for what she was looking at. She was going to spend the next several years looking for it. Marcus stood at attention and thought about the cost of dignity. He'd been thinking about it since he turned. Not the dramatic version, the cost in the moment, the risk of breaking protocol, the eyes of 214 people landing on 6 Marines who were supposed to be facing forward. The other cost. The cost Eleanor Hayes had been paying for decades. The cost of holding yourself together when the world kept finding new ways to take things from you. The cost of being the one who stayed when the one you loved had to go. The cost of making dinner after coming home from the airport. The cost of maintaining dignity when dignity was the only thing the system hadn't taken yet. He thought about what that cost added up to over 53 years. He couldn't do the math. The number was too large. What he could do was stand. He could stand straight and still and present for the man whose wife had paid that cost. That was his job today. He was going to do it right. Eleanor thought about James's hands. Not in the casket, she wouldn't let herself think about that. His hands in the kitchen. Making eggs on Tuesday mornings. The specific, careful way he cracked eggs. Always with one hand, always clean. A skill he'd picked up somewhere in 34 years that she'd never asked about and he'd never explained. She thought about his hands on hers. At his mother's funeral in 1983, he'd held her hand through the whole service. She looked at her own hands now, folded in her lap. One of them was wearing a ring he'd put there 53 years ago. She looked at the ring. She thought about the airport in 1971. She thought about the promise she'd made. No falling apart in public. She was keeping it. She was going to keep it. Not because she wasn't devastated. She was devastated. She was absolutely devastated in the way that you could only be devastated by the loss of someone who had been the architecture of your days for half a century. She was keeping the promise because James had known the difference between strength and performance. He'd known her. All of her. The parts she showed and the parts she didn't. The parts that held and the parts that cost. He'd known. And he'd loved all of it. Loved her for all of it. She was going to be worthy of that. Right to the end. She looked at the casket. She put her hand on her ring. She held it. The way she'd held everything. The service moved toward its end. The way all services did. Not with resolution, because grief didn't resolve, but with the specific necessary completion of ritual. The words said, the song sung, the silences held. What remained was the flag. The 6 Marines moved to the casket. Precise. Synchronized. The specific choreography of men who had practiced this enough times that the practice had become something else. Not muscle memory, but devotion. Each movement deliberate. Each fold exact. Eleanor watched. She'd watched this before at other funerals, other caskets, full flags folded for other wives sitting in other front rows. She'd never watched it for herself. She'd always known the day would come. She'd never known what it would feel like to watch it, and know that this time the flag was coming to her. It felt like the inside of her chest was made of something fragile. She didn't let it show. Marcus was at the head of the casket. His hands moved through the folds the way they always moved. Deliberately, without hesitation, each crease sharp and clean. He'd done this 23 times. He knew the mechanics perfectly. Tonight the mechanics felt insufficient. The flag deserved more than mechanics. He slowed down. Not by much. Enough. Enough to make each fold intentional rather than automatic. Enough to put something into it that wasn't in the training manual. He didn't have a word for what he was putting in. Respect was too small. Recognition was closer. The recognition of one person for another person's cost. He folded. When the flag was folded, Marcus carried it to Eleanor. He crossed the distance between the casket and the front row. He stood before her. He looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. The specific, full attention of someone who understood that this moment required being completely present. He knelt. He held the flag out. The specific triangle of it, tight, precise, the 13 folds that meant 13 things he'd been taught, and that now felt like not enough and exactly right simultaneously. He spoke the words. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. He'd said those words 23 times. This time they felt different. Because this time he knew something about the woman receiving them that he hadn't known about the others. He knew she'd stood on the steps. He knew she'd stood straight and still and present in the October cold without asking for anything. He knew what the flag was really for. Not for James. James had given enough. The flag was for Eleanor. For 53 years of giving things that didn't get medals, that didn't get ceremonies, that didn't get flags folded with precision and presented on bended knee. Eleanor took the flag, both hands. She held it the way James had held things he didn't want to drop. Carefully, completely. She looked at it. She thought about the kitchen table in 1971, just in case. She looked at Marcus. He was still kneeling, still looking at her. She said, "Thank you." 2 words. He nodded. He stood. He returned to his position. The room was very quiet. Not the silence of people being polite. The silence of people who had witnessed something and needed a moment before they could move again. Amara was not rolling her eyes. She was holding her grandmother's hand. She hadn't noticed when that had happened. Her grandmother hadn't noticed either. Some things happened without being decided. Gerald Washington's hands were still pressed flat on his thighs. But they weren't white-knuckled anymore. Something had released. Not the grief, the holding. He'd held it long enough. He let his face do what it needed to do. In the back of the room, Richard Hollis watched Eleanor hold the flag. He thought about the steps, about the 30 seconds before he'd opened the door, about the 19 years of funerals that had taught him how to manage grief efficiently. Nobody had taught him how to recognize it when it was standing outside. He was going to think about that for a long time. Reverend Cole spoke the final words. The service was ending, but the room wasn't ready to end. The room needed another moment. He gave it one. He let the silence run longer than protocol suggested. He'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the most important thing you could do in a room full of grief was nothing. Just let it be what it was. Let people feel what they came to feel. Don't rush them toward the exit. The exit would find them. He waited. The room breathed. Eleanor held the flag. People don't leave funerals the way they leave other places. They drift. The specific, reluctant drift of people who came to say goodbye and aren't quite ready to finish saying it. They stand in small groups. They hold cups of coffee they don't drink. They find the people they came with and stay close because the outside world suddenly feels too large and too indifferent, and the room, despite everything, still feels like the right place to be. The reception was in the hall adjacent to the service. Food that 3 women had spent 2 days making. The specific abundant generosity of communities that expressed love through feeding people. Eleanor sat at a table near the window. Patricia had arrived. Flight landed at 10:47. Car from the airport. She'd walked in during the final hymn and found her mother sitting in the front row, holding a folded flag, and had understood immediately that the morning had been something she'd missed and would spend a long time hearing about. She sat beside her mother now. She didn't say anything about the morning. Not yet. She just sat, close enough that their shoulders were touching. Eleanor didn't say anything either. She held the flag in her lap. She looked at the window. Outside, October was doing what October did, the specific, beautiful, melancholy work of a season that knew it was ending. Marcus found her at the table. He'd changed out of dress blues into his civilian clothes. The specific, slightly strange transition of becoming a regular person again after spending hours as something more formal. He looked younger in regular clothes. He always did. He stood at the edge of the table. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. Eleanor looked up. "Sit down," she said. He sat. Patricia looked at him. Eleanor said, "This is one of the men who came outside." Patricia looked at him differently then, with the specific, grateful attention of someone who had missed something and was trying to understand its shape from the descriptions of people who had been there. "Thank you," Patricia said. Marcus looked at Eleanor. "She doesn't need to thank me," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "She's thanking you anyway." He nodded. He accepted it. They sat for a moment. The hall around them was doing what halls did after funerals, filling with the specific, necessary noise of people who had been quiet for too long and needed to talk again. Stories about James. Laughter at the ones that deserved laughter. The particular sound of a community remembering someone together. Eleanor listened to it. She liked it. James would have liked it. He'd never been comfortable with solemnity that went on too long. People should eat and talk, he'd said once after a funeral they'd attended together. Sitting quiet for too long just gives grief more room than it needs. She smiled at the memory, small smile, the kind that cost something and was worth it. "Can I ask you something?" she said to Marcus. "Yes," he said. "When you turned," she said, "what did you see?" He thought about it, not performing the thought, actually thinking. "I saw a woman standing the way my grandmother stood outside a hospital once," he said. "When they told her visiting hours were over and my grandfather was still inside." He paused. She didn't leave. She just stood there. Like leaving wasn't something she was capable of. Eleanor looked at him. "How long did she stand there?" She said. 3 hours, he said, until they let her in. "Did they let her in?" She said. "Eventually," he said. "Good," she said. She looked at the flag in her lap. "James would have liked you," she said. Marcus looked at her. "He was the kind of man who noticed things other people missed," she said. "He would have noticed you." Marcus didn't say anything. "Some things you just received." Gerald Washington found her next. He'd been working up to it since the service ended. He was 67 years old and had spent a lifetime being better at action than at words, and had stood in the reception hall for 20 minutes trying to figure out which words were right, before deciding that the right words didn't exist, and he should go anyway. He went. He stood at the table. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Gerald Washington. I served with James, 1989 to 1991. Eleanor looked at him. "Georgia," she said. "He talked about you." Gerald blinked. "He did?" he said. "He said you were the funniest man on the base," she said. "He said you could make anyone laugh, including people who had forgotten how." Gerald stood with that. With the specific, disorienting gift of learning something about yourself through the eyes of someone who was gone. "I didn't know he said that," he said. "People don't always say things to your face," Eleanor said. "Doesn't mean they're not saying them." He sat down. He stayed for 40 minutes. He told her stories about James she hadn't heard. She told him stories about James he hadn't known. That was what funerals were for. Not the ceremony, not the flag, not the precision and the protocol and the dress blues. The stories. The specific, irreplaceable accumulation of a life told by the people who had witnessed pieces of it. James Hayes had lived in a lot of people. They were giving him back to Eleanor now. One story at a time. Richard Hollis found her last. He'd been waiting for the right moment and had finally understood there was no right moment, and that waiting for it was its own kind of cowardice. He walked to the table. Eleanor looked at him. She knew who he was. She'd known the moment she walked in and seen him standing at the back of the room. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He looked at his hands. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Yes," she said. "You do." He looked up. "I followed procedure," he said. "That was wrong." "You followed procedure correctly," she said. "The procedure was wrong." He looked at her, at the distinction she'd made. "Does that matter?" he said. "To you. Does it matter which one was wrong?" She thought about it. "It matters for next time," she said. "If you think you were wrong, you'll just try to follow procedure better. If the procedure is wrong, you'll change it." He sat with that. "Which one do you think it is?" he said. "Both," she said. "The procedure needs changing, and you needed to look up from it long enough to see who was standing on your steps." He nodded. He accepted it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what it cost you." She looked at him, at a man trying to understand something he'd gotten wrong and not making excuses for it. James would have respected that. "It cost me 20 minutes," she said, "in the cold, in this dress." She paused. "It could have been worse." "Because of them," he said. He meant the Marines. "Because of them," she said. She looked at the flag in her lap. "Change the procedure," she said. "That's the apology I want." He looked at her. "I'll do that," he said. "Good," she said. "Is that enough?" he said. She looked at him. "It's a start," she said. Patricia drove her home. The same route Eleanor had taken in the cab that morning. Different direction. Longer somehow. Or maybe just fuller. The specific, weighted quality of a car ride at the end of a day that had asked more of you than you'd expected to give. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat with the flag in her lap. Both hands on it. The way you held things you weren't ready to put down yet. Patricia drove. She didn't play music. She didn't talk. She'd learned that from James. Sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was nothing. Just be in the car. Just drive. They passed the funeral home. Eleanor looked at the steps, at the place she'd stood for 20 minutes in the October cold in a black dress she hadn't worn since 1983. She looked at it the way you looked, at places where something had happened to you. Not with anger. Not with relief. With the specific, clear-eyed attention of someone cataloging an experience before it became memory. It had happened. She'd stood there. 6 men had turned. A door had opened. She'd walked in. That was the whole thing. That was enough. "Mama," Patricia said. Eleanor said. "Tell me about this morning." Eleanor looked at the flag. She thought about where to start. She started at the airport. The promise she'd made. Patricia listened. She hadn't known about the promise. 50 years of watching her mother be the kind of woman she was, and she hadn't known the promise was underneath it. Eleanor told her about the cab, the wrong entrance, the list, the steps. She told it plainly, not for sympathy, because Patricia had asked, and Patricia deserved the true version. When she got to the Marines, Patricia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 6 of them, Eleanor said, all at once, without anyone saying a word. Patricia was quiet. "You should have called me," she said. "You were on a plane," Eleanor said. "I know. I should have." Patricia. "Yes. You couldn't have done anything from a plane." "I know. I still should have." "Stop," Eleanor said. Not harshly. "You couldn't have. And it worked out. Let it have worked out." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Eleanor said. They pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same. It always looked the same from the outside. Inside, it was different now, and would be different for a long time, and then would become a different kind of same. Not the same as before, but its own thing, the specific evolved shape of a home learning to be itself after loss. Eleanor knew this. She'd watched other people learn it. She'd learn it herself. She was already learning it. She went to the kitchen first. She put the flag on the table, James's chair across from it. She made tea, the same tea she made every evening, the specific, unchanged ritual of a body that knew what it needed when the mind was too tired to decide. She sat at the table. She looked at the flag. She looked at James's chair. She thought about 53 years of sitting at this table. The mornings, the evenings, the specific, unremarkable accumulation of days that were ordinary until they weren't anymore. She thought about all the things she hadn't said, not because she'd been afraid to say them, because there'd been time. There was always supposed to be time. She thought about the things she had said, more than she'd realized. 53 years of said things. That was something. That was a lot. Patricia came in with her bag. She put it down. She sat across from her mother, not in James's chair, beside it. They sat together. The tea steamed. Outside October finished what it had started. Tell me something about him, Patricia said. Something I don't know, Eleanor thought. She thought about the eggs on Tuesday mornings, the roses in the spring, the flag on the kitchen table in 1971. Just in case. She thought about his hands. Cracking eggs with one hand, clean. Every time. He could crack an egg with one hand, she said. He never told me where he learned it. I never asked. Patricia looked at her. That's what you want to tell me? She said. It's what I'm thinking about, Eleanor said. I'm going to think about it for a long time. Where he learned to crack an egg with one hand. Patricia was quiet. You should have asked, she said. Yes, Eleanor said. I should have. She picked up her tea. Ask the things, she said. Whatever you want to know about the people you love, ask them. Don't wait for the right time. She looked at her daughter. There isn't a right time. There's just time. And then there isn't. Patricia looked at her mother. At 81 years old, sitting at a kitchen table with a folded flag and a cup of tea and 53 years of things she should have asked and didn't, and things she did ask, and things she knew, and things she'd never know. All of it mixed together the way it always was with people you love for a long time. What do you want me to ask you? Patricia said. Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the specific searching attention of someone who had decided that today was the day they stopped waiting for the right time. She thought about what she wanted Patricia to know, what she wanted to make sure didn't get lost, what she'd been carrying for 53 years that deserved to be carried by someone else too. Ask me about the airport, Eleanor said, in 1971. Ask me what it felt like to watch him go. Patricia leaned forward. What did it feel like? She said. Eleanor looked at her hands, at the ring, at 53 years on one finger. She thought about the airport, about the promise, about the car ride home, about the dinner she'd made, about the keeping going. She looked at her daughter. She told her, all of it. Everything she'd carried. Everything that deserved to be known. 3 weeks later, Richard Hollis changed the procedure. Not the whole system. One thing. A standing instruction to all staff. If someone arrives at a service without verification and claims to be immediate family, you bring them inside first. You verify after. He wrote it himself. He put it in the staff manual. He thought about Eleanor Hayes every time he looked at it. Marcus didn't know about the change. He'd gone back to his life. His regular life. The one where he wasn't in dress blues and nobody was watching. And the decisions he made were small and private and didn't have 214 witnesses. He thought about his grandmother sometimes, standing outside the hospital, not leaving. He thought about Eleanor. Same stance, same refusal. He thought about the moment before he turned. The half-second where protocol and instinct were in the same space, and one of them had to win. Instinct had won. He was glad. He was going to keep letting it. Eleanor put the flag on the shelf beside the window. James's chair still at the table. The roses still in the garden. The eggs still in the refrigerator on Tuesday mornings. She'd started making them herself. One hand. She was still learning. Subscribe if you're new. Share this tonight and tell me in the comments. Who are you going to ask something today before there isn't time? I read everyone. See you in the next story.